think we've waited the requisite amount of time, and so let's get rolling. This is a fun one always, but it's an especially fun one to be doing with JJ Perino. JJ is the founder of 210. JJ, thanks so much for being here today. I'm really excited to be having this conversation.
It's a pleasure. I always look forward to this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we did it last year too, the 2 years out, so it'll be interesting to see how our opinions have shifted as we get further away. But a quick sense of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to start off with a brief introduction for those of you who are not familiar with Placer or not as familiar. And then we're going to dive into what we've learned. So we're going to look at some major topics with the perspective we now have a few years post pandemic. Then we have a few quick thoughts on some major topics that are talking that we'll try to get to. And as always, we will leave time for Q&A. If at any point throughout the conversation you do have a question, please use that Q&A button situated at either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have Zoom configured. So Placer is a location data company. For those of you who are unfamiliar, people vote with their feet. We're showing you how they vote across the United States every single day. We do that by observing a panel of 30 million devices. Very critically, this is all de-identified aggregate data, so we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then analyze that data with machine learning and AI algorithms in order to make estimations on retail visits across the country. And we present that data in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from cross-visitation, true trade areas, visit counts, customer journeys, and a whole lot more. If anyone's interested, we do have a free version of our premium product available at placer.ai. So check it out if you are interested. Let's dive in, because I find this topic super fascinating, but I think kind of the starting point in this year kind of needs to be the context we're operating within. So we know there's been these wider economic headwinds. How significant of an impact do you think the wider economic situation has made? And add to that kind of the pandemic caveat of how difficult do you think was kind of to jump from that environment straight into this one?
Yeah, I'll tell you, anything I think we assess out of it is sort of half learned at this point. I think it's just things are moving very quickly, and there's this. So let's just call out some stuff. So obviously, interest rates, inflation. Consumer delinquency is starting to increase on credit debt. We got a challenged consumer. We still have a really tight labor market. So there's a bit of these contradicting forces. And I'll tell you, at least from our perspective and our research, going from pandemic to this golden era of retail and consumerism in the US to the headwinds that we're facing now, things have happened very quickly. Typically that's an elongated period, and it's happening very quickly. And the data that we all look at is not necessarily that fast. And if it is, it's not necessarily that accurate. And the other thing that I just, using consumer spending as an example, if we look at the national retail data that came out Monday. So, retail sales slowing, still up month over month. Headlines say month over month. No one cares about that in the industry. We all care year over year, and it's still up, it's accelerating, depending on the category you're looking at. And so that's all interesting. But at the same time, we have people taking on more debt via credit cards. We have a new debt vehicle called Buy Now, Pay Later, or any one of those. And we can't see that yet. So we don't really know, can people pay for these things? What's going to happen when student loans come back? So, the most delinquent age group right now, I think it's 18 to 29. They're going to have student loans starting back up here. So I guess there's a lot of moving pieces, and I wish I had a crystal ball, but this is a really difficult thing to even discuss because there's contradicting forces. We don't really see everything clearly right now. And there's just a lot changing quickly.
I mean, it's such a great answer. We were having a conversation with someone else earlier today, and they were like, oh, well, this is the new normal. And we're like, well, nobody knows that yet. And even in some cases, I mean, think about a segment, Home Depot just announced earnings, recently, and it wasn't as great as they would like it to be, but how difficult is the context they're operating within? Things were the greatest they had essentially ever been. Then you have that pull forward of demand, plus a difficult economic environment, plus, you don't really know what's up and what's down yet. And it's really difficult to understand how do you contextualize this performance? I think the awareness of how opaque the situation is a very important starting point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you look at news today, so this morning Target released their Q1 sales, right?
Mhm.
Their comp sales were flat year over year, and everyone is mad. Their comp sales a year ago were, or their overall revenue a year ago was amazing. So it's
Yeah.
like we're mad that it's still amazing. I don't understand. So there's like an expectation gap, and we forget that we're looking at these things compounding. So if you look at if you look at sort of total retail sales, or you take Target or Home Depot and you sort of look at where they were pre-COVID, and then you continue that trajectory, we're way above that trajectory by almost every measure. So if you were to go just look at 6 years, you would be ecstatic about pretty much every indicator you would see. So I think what we're seeing is just a natural and healthy correction. Now, the question to me that I talk about with our clients all the time is, when does that correction become an overcorrection, and will we see
Mhm.
that? And you know, you look at like housing prices are stabilizing as interest rates are leveling, and that affects consumers' willingness to spend, and gas prices are down, but food prices are up. Just competing forces. And I don't know that we really know where this thing's going to land yet.
Yeah, I think the inflation piece always plays into it of like, but I really, that point really resonates with me. The silly, it's silly, but it's an important one. Like, our kind of example is always, LeBron James averages 32 points a game one season. The next season he averages 29 points a game. He's
Right.
not bad.
Right.
He's still tremendous. It's still an amazing year. It's just not the peak. And and again, the other's equally silly, but like we like it is, someone throws for 400 yards in a dome and someone else throws for 300 yards in the snow. Like, you have to consider context. Like, this is a difficult environment. Flat, even with inflation, is an important metric. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
I think another area though that's been equally, I think we're super eager to say, hey, we know what it looks like now, but I still don't think we do, is what is the situation with office real estate? And then what does that mean for the office retail real estate dynamic? Where do you think it's heading, and how close do you think it'll get back to where we were pre-pandemic?
It's not getting back to pre-pandemic. This is recorded. I probably shouldn't make statements like that because you're going to use it against me if it does. I honestly don't see a scenario where we go back to pre-pandemic. And there's a couple of data points behind that. So the first is, we have been leveled off with office populations. If you look at the Placer data, there's a good data set out there from Castle, their back to work barometer. It's been effectively flat, say within a few percentage points for over a year without really any movement. And any movement is predicated around holidays, weather. So it's like, and there's some variability geographically, like, things are much better in Houston and Austin on a recovery basis than they are in, say, San Francisco or Seattle or places like that. So there's a kind of a flatlining that we're seeing. And now we're, call it 3 years that people have been working in sort of this remote or hybrid environment. What is a habit? So what's the famous thing, like a habit you have to do X amount of times, or what?
Yeah, it's like they said, I had heard during the pandemic it was 3 months. That was what they were 3 to 6 months was habit.
Yeah, we're a little over that now. So you're going to be asking people to change their behaviors. And meanwhile, the industry has actually adopted, and I think this has been an incredible period of the retail world and the development world, because we're better serving our populations closer to home. This suburban boom that we all talk about, wherever people are, we're not serving them where they are. We're actually listening to our customers and making their lives easier. So why on earth are they going to go back? And there's data behind this. So there was actually some recent survey data that came out suggesting that thus far in 2023, only 1.5% of people who've taken a job are relocating for that job. Pre-COVID, that number was 11. That's a fall. Wow. It's a huge fall, right? So it went from 1 in 10 to 1 in 100 people that are relocating for a job because they want flexibility. There's value in that. And if you look at what's happened into some of these downtowns, like Chicago's, I think something I heard of recently, where they're taking the city's helping redo some zoning and putting up some money to rebuild office towers to redevelop them as housing. And they want 30 to 40% of those to be affordable housing, low income housing. Well, if you take thousands of people out of offices. You replace that with affordable housing. I'm not saying it's not the right thing to do. I'm just saying that that shifts the dynamic of what these downtowns look like. And then it starts to spitball. I think you're seeing that in places like Portland and San Francisco now, where you're like, well, there's a huge gap. I don't really want to go into this area or downtown, or I don't see the need to. So why would I? Right. So it's just like if you leave that gap open for too long, that vacuum may get filled with something that you don't love, and then it's harder to turn around. So
That's a super interesting point. I also I feel the exact same way, that it's, the question is always like which trends stick and which trends don't. I think most of them either have already gone back to normal or are in the normalizing process. I agree, the virtual work's not going anywhere, and it's because it's such a rational decision. Like if I can go into the office 2 to 3 times a week instead of 5, and that's most of what we're seeing. We're not seeing the office disappear. We're seeing a shrink in the amount of times people are going. That's better for me. That gives me a better life. It, in many cases, allows me to be more productive. And I think this is a balance we're going to need to wrap our heads around. I think we're just, will it be 60% of, will it be slightly higher? Is it be lower in some places? I'm sure, but I do agree with you. I think this is one of the ones that's absolutely going to stick and have major ramifications in a positive way as a result. All right. So you kind of mentioned the shift to the suburbs. I think another one we always talked about was people just kind of very often it was just the like kind of the speeding up of processes that were already existing. So people coming to Tampa, more people came to Tampa or, Austin. How significant of an impact do you think the shifts of people have been for retail real estate?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think I had a slightly different view on it maybe a year ago than we do now, because we have the gift of another year's worth of data and perspective, where we are seeing a lot of those migration patterns remain consistent. They're just slowing, and they're slowing in the context of house rate's not 2% anymore. So it's like there's a little more uncertainty in the economy, so people are trying to, I think, make a little more risk adverse decisions. But I think from a real estate perspective, what we're seeing is the continuation of what I mentioned earlier, where retail and developers are getting better at serving customers where they are. We're seeing great developments, from the Center Cals and the WSs and, developers like that out there who are really meeting the customer where they are. We're seeing retailers evolve their models to meet their, Tractor Supply is doing a good job of this. I think Nike's doing a pretty good job of this. There's others out there that are sort of adopting, to go find and serve customers where they want to be. But I also think it's interesting to think about, like, there was a really interesting article back in like 2018 titled "There'll Always Be Another Boise." And I think over the last few years, we're out of Boise's, we're out of Austin's. You know what I mean? Or like better said, like, what is the next one and how far away is it? Right? Is it Greenville? Is it Northwest Arkansas? Is it Springfield? Whatever it is, I don't know. I wish I could see that, but I think what we're going to see is Nashville and Tampa and these places are no longer, it's not a massive cost savings for consumers to go there. The development has met the consumers there. What's next? Where is the consumer going to go next? Or do we just say they just level out? We stay here? I don't know.
I mean, it's so interesting because you mentioned the ones who have these, like Nike, I think very notably has been at the edge of the wave of, hey, we have to think differently about what our stores do, depending on where they are and what we're attempting to accomplish within each location. And I think that's such a big piece of it. Like one of the brands that I feel like I got wrong because I didn't properly appreciate just how smart they were is Lululemon. Like one of the first things you kind of looked at was how many stores they had in such close proximity to each other. And you're like, oh, there's a cannibalization risk there. But then they're so smart about how you can have 3 locations in a fairly tight area, but they're all oriented differently. One's in a mall, the other one's like a big flagship, and something is somewhere in between. If you understand what you're trying to accomplish with each location and who it's intended for, it can be a little bit more sophisticated. So a question came in: do these migration patterns reflect flight from democratic regions to more conservative locations? I think there are better answers. I think the answer is very often like things like, and again, we can correlate these with political affiliations, but things like moving to places with from a higher HHI to a lower HHI or higher cost of living to a lower cost of living, higher opportunity for home ownership. I think there's a lot of reasons while people are moving. I'm sure some people move because of political affiliation. It's not, I don't think it's the most compelling answer. But there are people who very, very fervently disagree with that opinion.
I'll just add, well, hey, good on you for taking the political question. I was going to run away from that one, but yeah, I'll tell you what. So I think there's a correlation and causation issue here. So there's the correlation is 100% there. The redder parts of our country are booming. Generally speaking, the bluer parts are seeing that sort of pull away, and that's just the data. But to go say that is because of those factors, I think is a bridge too far. For right now, I think if you ask that question in 3 or 4 or 5 years, we may see a difference, purely because and we, you might mention this later, but like there's sort of COVID impacts, there's consumer and macroeconomic impacts, and then there's just political discourse in our country where people just don't like to talk to each other, and there's sort of this great divide, and we're seeing that in the states. If you look at like what legislation states are passing, it's going very different directions. So if we end up with very different looking state structures, then people may begin to move to states. We don't know that yet. The data does not support that. So I think that's just a correlation that someone could draw if they would like to, but it's not there yet.
I always found, it's interesting. I'll steal this from a friend, Brett Swango, who was over at Colliers. I was the first one who made me familiar with this data, but the cost of moving out of state outpaces the savings for the average American family by a significant margin. So the amount it would take to go somewhere for most people is too much, even if they wanted to leave, out of state. And so I do think, and it kind of makes sense. We see shifts. We're not seeing this 30% changes. This is like, they're small but significant shifts. I think when you think about why are you leaving New York City to go to the suburbs? Why are you leaving Chicago to go to somewhere else? Why? It's weather, home cost of living, state income tax, like all these things play a role. Again, these things could, I'm sure they do for some people, but for me, I agree with you. There's other things that kind of define the causation. One of the big topics that was, again, I think pre-pandemic, it's all retail apocalypse, goodbye stores, however nonsensical that was the conversation. And then the pandemic hits. I think my favorite example was Burlington, because if you remember, like they shut down their website like 3 weeks before the pandemic, and people were like, goodbye, Burlington. They're going, the way of others, and they've clearly done incredibly well. I mean, what do you think we've learned about the dynamic between digital and brick and mortar retail channels, especially when you compare it to where we were pre-pandemic?
I love it. My favorite person to follow for this topic on LinkedIn is a guy named Steve Dennis. I know you're familiar with Steve. Dude, he just beats this to death, and I love it. I love seeing it happen. There's a lot of negative about COVID. It's almost entirely negative about the pandemic, but I think there's been some good things. And one of those good things is this pandemic made retail better and smarter. And we no longer speak in such absolutes. We don't talk about, if you're not running multi-channel, you're gone. You can't just grow or be profitable as an e-commerce brand. I think what we're seeing is there's actually nuances in that, and these things play very well together. Again, this was the foundation of why Nike created the live concept. It started with a single location in California that connected physical and digital worlds and was tied to membership and brought these things closer together. And we're seeing that now, sort of the bellwether that I look at is, and we talk about it too much, but it's Warby Parker. I mean, they were the golden child, and they were out first, and then everyone hated them because they weren't making enough money. And they're still sort of on the edge of making money, but at the same time, they're saying stores are their base. I mean, their CEO said last week, 900 in the US. So, and that does, we'll come back to Warby in a second, but like that doesn't even account for like what Target has done with stores, which is mini distribution centers, closer to home, shorter times, in and out what you need. Target was so bold because they didn't make the decisions for the right thing for Target. They made the decisions for the right thing for their customers. That became the right thing for Target. And then they thought about it in those terms. And it was so powerful when they did that. So again, yes, if you read the Target headlines, you're going to think, I don't, you can think what you want, but like, it's not great news, but it is because they grew so much because they are meeting consumers, they are serving them the way they want to be served. Which sort of kind of brings up like the next evolution of that. So if you're a retailer and you're growing and you're thinking of marrying up this physical and digital world, which I think is the right thing to do, to your point earlier, Ethan, like what becomes the purpose of your stores? Are they brand awareness? Is it simply just to lower your customer acquisition cost? Are you trying to drive revenue and you build your business with them? Are you trying to, build affiliation and drive customers online? Like what's actually the goal of that? And then that has to fit into the brand piece of it, because there's a real question out there for brands like Warby Parker that you're super cool when you have 100 locations because you're like, people don't see you all the time.
Mhm.
When you have 900 and you're in every little town, are you still that cool?
I mean, that's an awesome point. Like I think Target's such a good example because I very much resonates with me what you said about they've always put the customer first. And I think that's because they understand that in the long term, if the relationship with the customer is strong, they're going to be strong, right? It's even if you don't love their latest earnings, if the customers still love going to their stores, they're gonna be okay. I feel like this idea of recognizing the physical is about more than just that sales per square foot metric is so important. I think it's, your Warby examples is so good because realistically, brands are not, I mean, and I'm sure there are counterexamples, but who's cool forever? Right.
Jordan.
And so if you're not cool forever, at some point, you got to be you have to evolve with your audience, or you have to figure out how to change to be there for your audience. And I think it's such an interesting thing. I haven't given this much thought, to be honest with you, but it's a really fascinating topic of like, if you're a really like, I'll give you an example of brands that I love. I love a brand that I love is True Classic. They do like the t-shirts and stuff for men. Like their audience, they're kind of launching retail locations. They're launching in major cities, but interestingly, their audience is a bit older. It's like 30s plus. There's a lot of us in the suburbs, right? Like, isn't some of these like retail strategies that, depending on who you're trying to reach, where you go is going to shift? And I think it's a really interesting question. I want to get to one that came in. So someone asked about scaling mobility data, and it was centered around this idea of like mobile usage is constantly increasing. So is this data just a reflection of like mobile visits going up? And it's a great question. The reason we are focused not on panel data, but on the estimations is to account for that. We think, you're right, if I double my panel, that doesn't mean visits doubled, right? But the whole point of using machine learning and AI is to offset that and leverage kind of that data to give us a more stable perspective. So even if my panel doubles, hopefully it'll improve my accuracy, but I won't change dramatically the perspective I'm bringing to the table. So hopefully that answers that. Okay, so a question came in. I'll go to you first on this, JJ. Are there any classically urban, he defines this as dense, walkable, transit-oriented, centrally located and already established cities, retail and commercial districts that are actually doing better compared to a pre-2020 baseline? I've heard certain residential areas within major cities, and I don't know if that's cheating.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm not aware of anything at broad scale, and it's generally not like major cities, with the exception of like, I don't know, I guess maybe Scottsdale doesn't hit that metric, but like Scottsdale is doing very well. Parts of Dallas, I mean Austin, downtown Miami, like around Brickell in that area, Miami Beach, more touristy. So there's a few. Downtown Tampa's one. There's a few, but to your point, it's more niche and pocketed. And then there's like, small towns, like I brought up Boise earlier, and towns like that are, it's not it's on a percentage basis, it's yes, but it's just not that big to really, fairly compare.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair, it's a nuanced answer to it's always like some of these questions are like, they're very well put. And like, it's just the reality is you have to give a nuanced answer to respond to them. Another one came in, are there any insights into the idea that consumers are traveling shorter distances and are less willing to travel far for their shopping, retail, and entertainment? The answer is we've seen it. Yes. Like the distance traveled for malls. And by the way, it's very, very interestingly correlated to areas where inflation is higher. And so, where gas prices have been higher, a year ago, people are traveling shorter distances and looking to accomplish more with each visit. Like, so that mission-driven shopping that we saw in the pandemic has come back in other situations when consumers are looking to be more efficient with their actions. So it's a great question. And yes, definitely something we are seeing in the data. I want to talk about experience. Has your perspective on the role of experience in retail changed? If so, how? If not, why?
I would say it's nuanced. Again, I mean, I think it's there's components of it that have changed. I think the biggest thing for me has been, seeing the definition of experience morph a bit. And, pre-COVID, if you look at, what, again, like the Nikes and a lot of these like very cool brands are doing, experience meant wow. It meant like giving consumers that wow moment. And I think we're kind of pulling off of that a little bit, although it does exist. I think now it's how do we make consumers extraordinarily happy? It's not a wow, but it just means like they feel good coming in. They like the experience. They had a great customer service interaction, which I think a lot of us will notice is becoming harder. I mean, there's with the labor issue in the States right now. I mean, it is competitive for labor. There are shortages of certain things. And so, to fundamentally build structure at these companies that is to feel welcome, to have a great customer service experience, seamless buyout. Lulu, again, Athleta, they do great jobs of this. They don't have what you want. You check out, you pay for it with your other things, and it's at your door 2 days later. Like, it's so easy that it's memorable. And so I think the experience is thought of almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like if we don't get the foundations right, the wow, the cool special stuff doesn't really matter. And so I think we're seeing that shift a little bit, which is interesting because I know you have like the House of Sport Dick's locations here. I'm going to reserve judgment on that because they got 2 locations. They have 3. One's not even been open a year. And so I'm going to like reserve judgment because I want to see how they comp. I want to see them expand it. I want to see how it grows. The one that's been open for 6 months is not, not knocking out of the park. So I think there's going to be a lot of learnings there. But then the question for me is going to be, they do have some really cool experiences. But does that bring repeat? Or do they rely on new visitors coming into their market? I don't know that answer yet.
I think it is a very good answer. I think the biggest takeaway of experience is that it's not, meaning in some cases, great. Like, I don't know, House of Sports might be an absolutely dominant concept. We might hear from Dick's that like, this is the greatest thing they've ever done since sliced bread in those locations. But I think the far more important element of experience is what happens every single day. Like my favorite example, and it is silly, but like, I call this stuff silly. It's not silly. It's actually just smart. It's like Bath and Body Works. Am I the biggest candle shopper in the world? No. But if I am at the mall for an extended period of time with my wife and we have our kids with us, me and my 4-year-old, we walk through, we smell lots of soaps and candles, and it is an engaging retail experience, even though there's no climbing walls, there's no basketball hoops, there's no like, I don't know, candle costumes. It's just really effective and well done. And I think that's it's weirdly not appreciated enough how important just a good basic experience is within a retail location. Talk about the second, so I'll save it for there. I want to talk about kind of the consumer specifically. How different do you think the consumer is now versus the pandemic versus pre-pandemic? And like, or how do you think the consumer has changed? And how much of it, what of those changes do you think are like temporary and what do you think are lasting? Like, how is the consumer fundamentally different than they were? How, and do you think they're going to stay fundamentally different?
Same consumer, slightly different expectations. But the expectations, I think, go back to some things that we've already talked about. And I think this data here hits on it. With people visiting coffee chains more midday. We're talking with the developer on the West Coast, saying they're seeing a lot more energy at their centers on Mondays. It's just hold over people's to-do list from the weekends. Their flexible work on Monday. They're getting stuff done. So it's that desire, I think, from customers or from shoppers is going to continue. I don't know that that's going to change because we've all adopted our lives to fit our sort of structure, which is, our work time is work time, our family time is family time, but those things are very intertwined these days, right? So, or they're interchangeable. So I think with more flexibility, we're going to see more of those patterns, continue to be patterns. We're going to continue to see that. We look at a lot of shopping center data, and we see that consistently. Like if you compare Q1 of this year to Q1 of 2019, I mean, your dwell times are different. When people come are different. What day of the week they come are different. So it's like there's pretty and we're not talking like a percent. We're talking multiple percent. So it's pretty significant changes. So I think that's like the behavioral side of it. But then there's also like a conceptual side of it, which is more like getting into the emotion and motives of individuals as far as like how these brands connect with them. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier, as far as, the macroeconomic situation varies greatly depending on income structure and what state or you're in the country right now, or what area that you're in. Then you have sort of your just local civic situation, right? Like if you're living in downtown Portland versus downtown Austin or Seattle, or like Tampa, your situations are different. So your behaviors will be different. You may be, in some cases, you're out at night and you're cool doing that. In other cases, you may not be. So there's and then there's, the political discourse and all the division and like, what has that meant for people? Are those pandemic hangover behaviors that we're seeing? Are they just actually something that's going to be around? I don't know. We really know all that yet. But
has it been a polarizing political environment? I didn't notice.
Yeah, ask Bud Light. So, it's tough, man. It's tough. And so I think that's where there's just a lot of things changing right now, and we continue to see it. But I think this, specifically when consumers choose to do things, is going to stay because consumers now have the choice and they want it and they're not letting it go.
I agree. I think that's like a really important point. I want to get to a couple of questions come in. One, I always get excited when I see a question from this person, but I won't call them out personally. But they ask, are Dick's House of Sports stores larger than average? Could that be why the visit length is up? I think also like the distance traveled is also longer every time we've looked at it. So like people are willing to come from further, spend further. I think also when we've looked at it compared to, it's hard to find a good comp. We'll look at like other Dick's Sporting Goods locations within that same region, and the patterns are pretty different. So I think it might have a small impact, but I do think there is something to be said for that experiential component.
I think a good comparison there could be looking at Shields, the full size Shields, which have Ferris wheels and little ranges and aquariums and all of that. Those are a little more House of Sporty, and those look a lot more like that. So I think some of it is size, but the size gives them the footprint to put in the experiences which people stay longer for. So I think there's actually a better comparison there between House of Sport and Shields than Dick's core platform and their House of Sport locations.
That's a great answer. So a question came in. When you're thinking about like scaling data, how do you look at like monthly, weekly, daily? And it's not usually a question we can answer in the setting, but I do think it's important. The honest truth is it depends on the question you're asking. Sometimes looking at daily data is the only answer, and sometimes it's way too refined and tight. And the best thing is to scale out and look at things at a monthly level. It really depends on the specific question you're asking. I want to get to one more. It says, why do you think 2021 was such a peak year for coffee chains? I don't know that it was a peak year for coffee chains, but I do want to take advantage of that question to kind of call out, at least for me, and I don't know if it's the same for you. I was surprised. We looked at Starbucks data at one stage of like their level of saturation in certain markets that they had called out of like, well, hey, we're going to expand and we think there's a lot of expansion room for us. And you're like, expansion for Starbucks? It feels like there's a Starbucks in every house in America. And yet when you look at some of these markets, there really is expansion opportunity. When you look at different coffee players, especially the kind of more regional ones, there feels like there is another level that the wider coffee sector can hit in the US.
You totally agree. I mean, I always joke, there seems to be no market capacity for coffee. like it's apparently infinite. Dutch Brothers is opening like crazy. Black Rifle Coffee opening like crazy. There's another one in the Southeast that escapes me right now that I just saw, Seven Brew or something like that, opening like crazy. BlackRock, and there's different formats that we're seeing, which again, I think this is all good for customers, honestly. Like if the demand's not there, businesses aren't going to open or they're not going to stay open. So clearly they're meeting a need, and that need is either, there's drive-through. So this is, shout out to Placer here. They've recently, not super recently, but they've launched the ability to do like short visit POIs. So we can see 1 minute dwell times, not just their standard 7. That's been a massive game changer for us because we can pick up those folks that, if we're looking at a coffee chain, those people, I hope you're not there 7 minutes. Sometimes we are, but like you get all these additional data points. And I think that sort of changes it. But no, there's a lot more capacity there, I think.
That's really cool. All right. I'm skipping this one. I want to go into, I want to talk about innovation. I think it's one of the most, I'm actually, for those of you who are coming to ICSE next week, Sunday at 1 p.m. at the Wynn, I'm going to be moderating a panel on just this topic. So that's my plug for that panel. But JJ, how do you think approaches to innovation within retail real estate and retail have changed as a result of what we've experienced and with specifically the pandemic? And what do you think it means for innovation moving forward?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I really liked is I feel like the pace of innovation is picked up, but it's a lot of going back to what we talked about earlier, where there's, it's not just the wow innovation. There is some of that, right? Dick's House of Sport is some of that. But it's just innovating in formats, where we open stores, how we open them, different size. Now we can stride our brand, and we've got, small concepts. I think there was a slider like Buff City Slope. Like Buff City's a great example of this. I mean, they're in major shopping centers, and they're in a little podunk town in Kansas I've never heard of. And it's a franchise, so it's different, but like they've innovated and they've segmented it. They're not just chasing trends. There's a lot of Browns out there that are not really just after what everyone else is doing. There's more format innovation, and there's more like go-to-market innovation. So, we're working with some great brands out of the Southeast that are that sort of started wholesale, selling to like dealers or whoever. Not really a big online presence. Maybe they do some specialty, but now they're opening stores because they've collected this data set. But they're very much like, we know where our customer is. We're just going to serve them where they are on vacation or whatever it may be. Like that makes a lot of sense, and they feel comfortable in doing that. And those formats have changed. They try a hotel lobby, they try a small shopping center, they try a street. And so like there's so much willingness, I think, to test formats and conceptual changes that it's no longer, the innovation is not just in the four walls, which I think is historically what we've talked about. What are you doing inside your walls? But now we're seeing it much more in everything outside of the walls. And I think that opens up a whole new and a bigger runway for these businesses.
I agree with you. I think the biggest thing is the rootedness in real problems. Like, I think the metaverse and blockchain and all drones and everything, it's really cool. And will it one day have an impact? I'm sure. But I feel like consumers just they want things that make their shopping experience better tomorrow, right? Retailers need things that improve that experience tomorrow. That's where innovation needs to be focused on. It's the stuff that kind of, it's interesting how the stuff that grabs headlines and the stuff that really makes a difference. Like I felt it, we were at NRF, the National Retail Federation show in January. And, we were talking with one retailer who was stopping by our booth, and we were like, well, what's the other thing you're really excited by that you're seeing? And it was stuff that was like, I don't want to say basic, but really focus on the basics.
It's fundamental.
Like, how do we create 100%
fundamentals? Yep.
Yeah. It never, and speaking of fundamentals, we get to talk about a few things about kicking off the year. And the one that made me sad was Bed Bath & Beyond closing. And let me be clear, it made me sad because, I was a fan of Bed Bath & Beyond back in the day. And then even more than that, I really thought this had turnaround potential. Like I thought it was they had that run, and then there was that one great earnings call, and I was like, oh man, this is gonna happen. What do you think we can learn from the ultimate kind of demise of Bed Bath & Beyond?
Well, I want to know the full story still. I feel like I don't know exactly what happened here, and it's all of its context. But, it's what we kind of hit on this earlier about just evolving with your customer and recognizing competition in the marketplace. There was a model that really didn't change in the face of new entrants to the market, a la Amazon and Target and Hobby Lobby and all these others, right? And if you want to know where a lot of that competition is, look at who's taking their spaces. There's going to be a lot of that happening out there, whether it's home goods or whoever. So I think, it's the Polaroid lesson. It's the blockbuster lesson. It's been learned time and time again of just keeping your eye on your customers and your competition. But again, I'm a little sad to see it go, but I think it's good for the overall health of our retail and real estate markets in the US. There's a lot of spaces out there that a lot of higher producing businesses want, that customers want. And while we may miss it, I don't know if we're done seeing Bed Bath & Beyond. I said that about Toys R Us too. They're kind of coming back. So who knows if we see it, but I think we're going to end up in a better situation where we're just going to be overall healthier. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, we already called out Steve Dennis once. Let's call him that again. I mean, he's been banging this drum for a while of like, it's got to be special. It's got to be for someone. It can't be dated.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that. All right, let's last question, and then we'll kind of prep ourselves for the weeks to come in Vegas. A third of the way into the year, seeing everything we've seen, maybe we're through April. What is the biggest takeaway for you for retail real estate thus far?
It's a good question. To me, and what we talk about with all of our clients is the ability to remain nimble and flexible. As things are changing, there is just what's going to happen with all these Bed Bath & boxes. Like the department store segment is seeing massive, I don't want to say massive, large traffic declines. They've closed a lot of stores. What is that going to mean for malls? In the absence of that, where does that traffic shift? So there's a redefinition of anchors. There's, I think, repurposing of malls. There's new and innovative development types coming on board to serve customers the way they want to be served. And I think the ability for anyone to be anything but flexible right now is going to be a strategic miss in the future. And I don't say flexible in the sense that, we're only signing 3-year lease terms. That's not it. I think there's places where you lock in. I think it's more about being flexible to customers, to an evolving market, to whatever this macro situation is. Do we hit a really big recession? Do we not? I don't know. Like, just in times like that, there's an ability to be nimble, because in every scenario, like when we do scenario planning, every scenario has significant opportunity if we're open-minded to it. And it may not be what we've done or what we know, but if we're open-minded to where the opportunity presents, I think there's only upside.
I mean, is there a better post-pandemic lesson that even difficult situations offer opportunities? I don't think so. Came in. The lesson is clearly warming up, getting outdoors, and getting ready for swimsuit season.
I love it.
I'm with you.
I got to go to Vegas next week. It's time to get ready.
Favorite.
I got 1 week.
That's common. JJ, thank you so much for joining us. This is such a pleasure as always. I really appreciate it. Everyone else, thank you all for being here today. For those of you who will be in Vegas next week, come and say hi. We're looking forward to seeing everyone there. And join us in a few weeks. We have a civic-oriented webinar led by my colleague, Ian Ross, who runs our civic program in early June on that segment. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and a wonderful rest of your week.